Shalom and welcome to the Middle East Report. In this programme today we'll be asking, is it time that the British government suspend its finance to UNWRA, the United Nations Relief Works Agency, in light of the corruption scandal? Warm welcome to the programme, and today's guest is all the way from Scotland, a good friend of mine and of the Middle East Report, Michael McCann, the Director of Israel-Britain Alliance. Michael, great to have you back on the programme.
Thank you very much, Simon. Delighted to be here.
And Michael, can you share with us some of your recent campaigns and activities you've been on since you've last been on the programme, and just share with us the measured success of some of these campaigns, because the work you're doing is extremely important in making our MPs aware of the issues they should be when it comes to Israel and the Middle East.
Well, thank you for that, Simon, and thank you to all Revelation TV viewers for the support that they give us in our campaigns. We continue our work to build the advocacy network across the United Kingdom. Our most recent campaign was about human shields, highlighting the outrageous efforts of Hamas using their own people, women, children, innocent civilians, as human shields on the Gaza border. And we teamed up with someone who your viewers will probably know, Ian Austin MP, very courageous Member of Parliament who left the anti-Semitic Labour Party and became an independent MP. And Ian sponsored an event where we brought over live IDF soldiers to the Houses of Parliament in order that they could give their testimony to members of Parliament and members of the House of Lords. So it was a fantastic event. People there, extraordinary names. Your viewers would be surprised to learn that people like Caroline Lucas, arch-Israel enemy, people like Stephen Kinnock, also regarded as probably an arch-Israel enemy in terms of some of his behaviour, but they were forced to turn up because their constituents had contacted them in huge numbers and said, listen, you've got to, if you want to be parliamentarians and you want to make good judgments on the issues that are before you, then you have to hear both sides of the argument. And it's quite clear that Hamas, the terrorist organisation, is abusing their own people, using their people as human shields, and because of that, people are getting killed in these diabolical schemes that they create in order to confront Israel. So that was the last campaign. Once again, a huge five-figure haul in emails. Remember the early days, Simon, where we maybe get 1,000 or 3,000 emails? Now we're getting tens of thousands, all because of the support that's out there in the UK and because of the valuable support we get from Revelation TV.
Fantastic. And your latest campaign you're here to discuss is UNWRA, which is the United Nations Relief Works Agency, which deals with the so-called Palestinian refugee problem. Can you explain to us what your concerns are with this UN agency?
Well, there are many scandals in our world, many of which we probably don't know about, but one of the biggest hiding in plain sight is UNWRA. The United Nations Relief and Work Agency. It was founded in 1949, the 8th of December 1949. A year later, the UNHCR, the United Nations High Commission for Refugees, was founded. And lo and behold, they didn't use the same criteria for finding or creating UNWRA. Bottom line is this: UNWRA is inefficient, it's corrupt, and it's an obstacle to peace. And the biggest problem that we have is that every year, UNWRA creates a new generation of refugees because unlike any other refugee who becomes a citizen of the new country that they're adopted by and therefore they don't have refugee status anymore, Palestinian refugees get this extraordinary right to pass down their refugee status through the male line. So in other words, there are people across our world who claim they're Palestinian refugees that have never ever been to that part of the world. All they're looking for is a compensation that will come when a final agreement is finally made on how they deal with this Middle East crisis, the whole Israel-Palestinian question.
So let's have a look now at a promotional video produced by UNWRA itself that shows the work of their organisation in helping the so-called Palestinian refugees.
Palestine.
For Palestine refugees.
For Palestine refugees.
For Palestine refugees.
For Palestine refugees.
My heart does go out to the plight of those Palestinians, but firstly we've got to identify how they are treated in so many different Arab countries, treated like worse than third-class citizens. And you have to ask yourself, the very, very important question is, who is responsible for the mess that they're in? Which leads me on to my next question with you, Michael, that, as you say, UNWRA was established in 1949, nearly approaching its 70th anniversary. And the Palestinian or the Arab delegation rejected a two-state solution back in 1947. A few months later, Israel was invaded by 5 Arab armies, in which the Arab leaders called for the destruction of the State of Israel and told these Arabs living in Israel that they should flee and they can return their homes later. So surely the blame for this has to be put on the Arab states for invading the newly formed State of Israel back in May of 1948.
I share your views on the Palestinian refugees, and I put that refugees in inverted commas, but the video we've just watched is a tissue of lies from the beginning. The campaign that we'll run will be titled hashtag, I'm getting all trendy now in terms of the new social media terms, hashtag UNWRA 70 years of failure. They are celebrating that video, the fact that they're still there after decades of this dispute, whilst UNHCR, the United Nations High Commissioner for Refugees, measures the success in how few refugees there are. UNWRA measures the success in how many they have, and the fact that they've got all this network of people, this state that's been created to support the Palestinian refugee problem. What it doesn't mention in the video is that when UNWRA was created on the 8th of December 1949 and went to work in 1950, it also looked after refugees, Jewish refugees. But this is the difference. In 1952, the State of Israel said, we don't need your help anymore. We will look after our people. And then nearly 7 decades later, since the formation or the creation of UNWRA, the Palestinian refugees are still being looked after by this organisation, which, as I mentioned at the top of the programme, is inefficient, corrupt, and now a massive obstacle to peace.
Michael, the UNWRA is an organisation, its annual budget is 1.2 billion US dollars. They employ 30,000 people. What are we getting in terms of this organisation and the huge amounts of resources that it just pulls in?
Well, let's focus on the numbers. If the original, bear in mind, we'll come on to it later probably, but there were a lot of Jewish refugees expelled from Arab lands at this period, actually more than the original estimated 740,000 Arab refugees created by the war that their leaders started in 1948. But let's look at those numbers. If in normal circumstances there had been a solution created, a few years after the war, or even if we had just let the natural progression of time deal with those numbers, there would only be 20,000 people left from 1948 that were displaced in some way. 20,000, a completely manageable number. But here's the rub: because of that patrilineal system of hereditary refugee status, there are estimated to be over 5 million Palestinian refugees. Why is that important? Because the Palestinian leadership and all the Arab countries don't want this problem to go away. Normally, states surrounding a war zone would take in refugees after a dispute. They refuse to take in their own people. and wanted to become refugees, wanted to become victims in order that it was an open sore for a crisis that we continue to develop and flare up, as we know, as it does from time to time. It's an utter scandal that it's celebrated in the way it is with that video. And of course, we'll probably dive a bit deeper into one of the people who was in that video, the chief operating officer, who's now mired in a scandal of his own.
So let's have a look at this excellent video produced by Prager University that looks at why is there a Palestinian refugee problem.
Visit Israel, and you'll be startled by how many colors you'll see. I don't mean the colors of the buildings or landscape. I mean the colors of the people. Black, white, olive, brown, and everything in between. Israel is a true United Nations. That's because Israel is a nation of refugees from everywhere. And more than half of them are from, are you ready? Arab countries. Over 850,000 Jews were expelled or fled from the Middle East and North Africa following the Arab countries' attack on Israel when it gained its independence in 1948. For over 2,000 years, these Jews had lived in the Arab countries of Morocco, Algeria, Tunisia, Libya, Egypt, Yemen, Syria, Lebanon, and Iraq, and in the Muslim but non-Arab countries such as Turkey and Iran. Today, they form over half of Israel's Jewish population. Many of these Jews from Middle Eastern lands look, well, just like other people from Middle Eastern lands, of darker complexion with dark hair. Other Jews migrated from North Africa. So why is their story so unfamiliar to most people? The most important reason is that they didn't remain refugees for long. But refugees they most certainly were. The vast majority forced to leave their homes, possessions, and businesses behind. In other words, they came to Israel with nothing. Some 650,000 of the Jews forced to flee North Africa and the Middle East became citizens of Israel. The other 200,000 fled to the United States and other Western countries. To give you an idea of how few Jews remain in Arab countries, consider these numbers. There were 150,000 Jews in Iraq in 1948. Today, there are less than 10. There were 140,000 Jews in Algeria. Today, there are less than 50. There were 75,000 Jews in Egypt. Today, less than 20. The pattern is the same across North Africa and the Middle East. Now contrast these forgotten Jewish refugees with the most celebrated refugees in the world, the Palestinians. How is it that the Jewish refugees are not even an afterthought, but the Palestinians are the longest lasting, most lavishly supported refugee population in the history of the world? The answer is purely political. After Israel gained its independence in May of 1948, the surrounding Arab nations attacked the new Jewish state. As a result, about 700,000 Arabs living in Israel fled. Many left because of the war, and many did because they were told by Arab leaders to leave the Jewish areas. The idea was that they would return once the Jews and their state had been destroyed. Khalid al-Azam, the Syrian prime minister in 1948 to 1949, admitted this Arab role in persuading Palestinians to leave. In his memoirs, he wrote, "Since 1948, we have been demanding the return of the refugees to their homes, but we ourselves are the ones who encouraged them to leave." That's how the Arab, later renamed Palestinian refugee crisis was created. In 1949, the United Nations formed UNWRA, the United Nations Relief and Works Agency for the Palestinian refugees, the largest and only long-term UN agency that was ever formed to deal with just one group of refugees. 70 years later, it still exists and still calls the Palestinians and their children and their grandchildren refugees. It has an annual budget of over $1 billion, funded mostly by the US and the European Union. How much did the Jewish refugees who were expelled from the Middle East and North Africa receive from the UN? How much did Israel receive to help toward their resettlement? How much does it receive today? The answer to all three questions is the same: zero. So the next time you hear someone talk about the Palestinian refugees, ask them why they never talk about the Jewish refugees. And the next time you hear people talk about Israel being settled by Europeans, ask them if they've ever seen an actual picture of Israelis in color. I'm Dumisani Washington of Christians United for Israel.
And as we saw there, absolutely superb analysis. The fact that there were over 700,000 Jewish refugees from Arab lands who were forced out of their countries, despite the fact they've been there since biblical times, is absolutely shocking. I suppose we have to ask ourselves the very, very important question, Michael, is that as UNWRA celebrates its 70th anniversary as a UN agency, why are Western governments, particularly the UN, pouring so much money into this UN agency, and yet we know it's corrupt, it hasn't solved one single Palestinian refugee problem, and actually perpetuates the problem? Why are so many nations blindly funding this UN agency?
Can I say, first of all, I would argue that the numbers in the video we've just watched about Jews being expelled from Arab lands, I would argue that actually qualifies for the definition of genocide rather than just simple expulsions, because many people were killed during that period as well. But here's the answer to your question. Cowardice is the answer to your question. Cowardice because they know UNWRA was a short-term measure. Israel proved that by saying to UNWRA in 1952, we don't want you or need your services anymore. We're a nation sovereign state and we will deal with our own people. So therefore, since that period and the decades that have elapsed since, there has been no movement in the peace process. And this is where the other madness is then exposed, because UNRWA's mission to provide those relief and works that they prescribe in their mission is not linked in any way to the mission of getting peace. It's completely separate. So therefore, the Arabs, or the Palestinian leaders as they became, want to retain UNRWA because they know that it doesn't matter what they do. They can say no to peace. Hamas can start its violence against Israel with a rocket fire. Fatah can continue to pay terrorists or shaheed when they kill Israelis in prison. And they know that it doesn't matter what they do, the money will not stop. You know, in any other situation, there's carrots and sticks involved in negotiation. There's carrots, you know, whether or not the deal of the century ever comes off, but the carrot will be financial compensation and all sorts of different ways within those types of deals to get a solution. But there also has to be a stick, and the stick has to be, well, if you don't want to negotiate and you're being unreasonable, then we're going to take away this infrastructure that's currently looking after your people. There is no stick, because UNRWA will be there. And the big problem with UNRWA is become, or arguably become, its own nation state. It's utter madness that the United Nations, which wishes to reduce the number of refugees, has on its books an organisation, the most expensive organisation looking after refugees, which prolongs the problem. UNRWA spends 3 times as much on its refugees than any other refugee from any other dispute in the world. And it continually contradicts itself in terms of what its mission is, because there are huge salaries involved in this whole process. It's estimated that something like 65 to 70% of that budget, which actually might actually be closer to $1.6 billion rather than 1.2, is going in salaries. And, you know, when you look at the sorts of standards that the chief executive operates to in terms of the money he's paid, and, of course, the allegations that he gave his mistress a job and then flew her round about the world in order to accompany him, you know, it all becomes clear that UNRWA is a failed mission and it needs to be stopped, and something needs to be put in its place, which creates that carrot and stick leverage which is necessary for a negotiation to end this dispute.
Also, isn't one of the major problems that UNRWA is doing is supporting the Palestinian cause and the Palestinian leadership's desire of what they claim so-called as a right of return, that in any peace treaty with Israel, the Palestinians are demanding a right of return. Now, the reality is that they left their homes freely, the vast majority, about 90% left their homes and fled Israel during Israel's War of Independence when Israel was attacked by 5 Arab armies. And the fact is that they call upon wanting to return to Israel proper would destroy Israel in terms of the mass population of millions of Palestinians coming into Israel, and it would no longer be a Jewish state. And UNRWA supports that position.
Well, if you had looked at the definition we use for refugees in general, there'd only be 20,000 left. It wouldn't be an issue. Quite frankly, Israel could accommodate 20,000 refugees, and it could have accommodated the declining number from 1949, 1950 onwards. So 740, it's estimated. Each year that would have reduced, and the numbers have got more manageable. But because of UNRWA's definition, it increases. And there's another issue that you've rightly identified, is that UNRWA has gone native. UNRWA actually it can be accused, quite rightly, because there's huge amounts of evidence that exists to support this claim, can be accused of backing the Palestinian cause when it's meant to be neutral. And we know that there's been huge abuse of UNRWA in terms of its ambulances, which have carried weapons for Hamas. We know that in terms of the rocket fire that comes into Israel, that the very high-tech capability of the Israeli army is able to identify the launch sites, which turn out to be UNRWA hospitals and UNRWA schools. And I've been there. I've been to an UNRWA school in both Judea and Samaria, aka the West Bank, and in Gaza. And we see children being educated, which is a great thing, but their schools are being used as caches for all sorts of munitions as well. And the problem that we've got now is that it actually boasts that it's the biggest provider of education in the Middle East. It shouldn't be. Those services should be provided by the state that can be created for the people and be led by the people and be led by elected representatives of the people. All of this has been denied to the Palestinian people since UNRWA's creation. And quite frankly, Donald Trump has led the way to a degree, but the problem with Donald Trump is he said he's not going to fund it, but then the problem is, well, how do you deal with the problem that's been created? You can't just ignore the fact that there are many tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands, millions now, refugees from that Palestinian crisis. So, yeah, you can say we've had enough of UNRWA, but you have to have a logical way forward, and so far that's not been identified.
Let's have a look now at one very courageous and brave Palestinian talking about the corruption that is at the very heart of UNRWA.
It's a little bit difficult to explain what is UNRWA. In my opinion, UNRWA is one of the biggest corrupt international organization around the world. UNRWA almost established in 1952, according to one of the UN resolutions, to solve the problem of the Palestinian refugees, these people who ran away from their houses and their lands during the war, 1948. And those Palestinians who ran away in 48, some of them came to the West Bank, some to the Gaza Strip, some to other Arab countries like Lebanon, like Syria and Jordan. And UNRWA in 1952 decided to build refugee camps for those Palestinians who used to live under tents in that time. And to deal with the issue of the Palestinian refugees and to solve the issue of the Palestinian refugees. Since 1952 until today, I am asking myself a question: what UNRWA really did to the Palestinian refugees? I am a person who believes that UNRWA today, trying to keep the Palestinian refugees as hostages inside the refugee camps. Because by keeping the Palestinian refugees as hostages in the refugee camps, that's giving more power and more money for UNRWA. The yearly budget of UNRWA today is around $1.6 billion a year. I believe that over than 65% of this amount going for salaries. We are talking about 30,000 employees here. The question is, for how long the international community can continue funding UNRWA? And for which purposes? When UNRWA really going to solve the issue of the Palestinian refugees? When the international community will wake up to solve the issue of the refugees? I think that the international community, together with UNRWA, trying to keep these camps in terms not to solve the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, which means that the international community, together with UNRWA, almost became a part of the conflict rather than a part of the solution. This is one of the major problems, I think, of the Palestinian refugees. Listen, I developed and grown up for 33 years in a refugee camp in Jerusalem. I visited also a lot of refugee camps in Lebanon, in Syria, and in Jordan. Still, I got relatives in Jordan who are living in refugee camps since 1952. And I am wondering, when the Palestinians refugees will wake up one day and start fighting for their own rights. You know, in 2009, there is a very remarkable Palestinian organization conducted a survey among the Palestinian refugees in diaspora. And the question was, which solution you will accept as a refugee? 70% of those refugees ask for compensation rather than for the right of return. And UNRWA knows that very well. And the international community knows that very well. But if the international community and UNRWA will start compensating those refugees, that means that the Israeli-Palestinian conflict almost solved. But the interest of the international community and UNRWA, not to solve it. And this is how the Palestinians almost kept for so long years inside the refugee camps.
And now we see a very brave and courageous Palestinian talking about the corruption and the failure of UNRWA to solve the so-called Palestinian refugee problem. Michael, what were your thoughts on his comments, knowing that he's standing against the Palestinian leadership, he's exposing UNRWA, and probably faces death threats for doing that?
Well, I think he has carefully chosen his words, and he claims that UNRWA is holding the Palestinian refugees hostage, and he claims that it's in UNRWA's interests to avoid the compensation question. I don't think it's UNRWA that are holding them hostage, or that the compensation question relates to UNRWA either. I think the Palestinian refugees are being held hostage by Palestinian leaders and Arab leaders, because in terms of the hostage issue, because the issue, rather than decreasing every year as it should do, increases every year, that becomes a larger bargaining chip for the Palestinians. Moreover, Hamas can incite their people to participate in crazy disputes with Israel at their border. But also in terms of the hostage situation that Bassem referred to, and the compensation element of it, of course that would make a lot of the problem disappear. When the 2000 deal with Ehud Barak, Bill Clinton, Yasser Arafat was put on the table, my understanding is that it was something like $40 billion in compensation offered. Now, obviously that figure would have increased if you were looking at a negotiation in 2019. But again, Palestinian leaders don't want their people to have a say on that, because they know that that completely breaks the back of their whole case when it comes to the question of the land and Jerusalem and borders and land swaps and so on and so forth. I met a Palestinian refugee in Washington, D.C. when I was attending the AIPAC conference, and he was there to demonstrate the lunacy that he will be paid compensation if a deal is ever done. He's never stepped foot in the land, and it was his great-grandfather that was an original refugee. Now, this is the madness of the international community perpetuates, because they don't resolve the UNWRA question because of the cowardice that lies within it. And of course the fact that the majority of nations that make up the United Nations are not democracies. Many of them are Muslim states who blindly support the Palestinian cause without thinking about the ramifications. And why should they? They don't think of the ramifications of their own countries where they treat their people so badly and don't have any democracy. So therefore, why should they care about the whole question of democracy for the Palestinian people?
I suppose the big issue that rises from what you've just said there, Michael, is the fact that if the Palestinians are demanding billions in compensation, then what about the forgotten Jewish refugees who were forced to flee their homes, and they've been there since biblical times, many from the Babylonian conquest of Jerusalem, and were expelled from their land, taken to Babylon, which is now modern-day Iraq, and have lived there since Babylonian times. And, they were forced out with only one piece of suitcase for themselves. So they're leaving their businesses behind, they're leaving their homes and their properties behind, worth billions. Who's going to compensate these forgotten Jewish refugees who fled to Israel with nothing?
Well, we still get the claims against the German government now about the atrocities that the Nazis committed in WW2. I think it's testimony to the bravery and the character of the people who created the reborn Israel in 1948, that the first thing in their minds was not how much money are we going to get for the people who have been displaced as a result of the tensions in the Middle East and around that part of the world. Actually, the Israeli government had a very strong view that they shouldn't claim compensation because it would undermine the whole question of Israel and being a nation. They said, no, we don't need money from anybody else. We're going to grow our own country and we're going to build it. And who can blame them for the success that tiny nation in the southeastern coast of the Mediterranean has had since it was reborn in 1948. So I commend their spirit. I commend what they've achieved in that short time. But what they have to bear in mind is that, think of your viewers. If they're sitting in their homes watching this show and someone comes along and says you must leave under the threat of violence, so they leave their home, their property, any value that has, that they would hope at some point in the future to pass on to their children or grandchildren, that's all taken away from you. And therefore I don't think it should be denied to them. In fact, I would argue that the countries that they were expelled from should pay them compensation. But if that's not to come to pass, then the United Nations should have a role in ensuring that they're properly compensated for the historical challenges that they faced when they were expelled from their homes.
Absolutely. But if we look at the conditions of these refugee camps, whether they're in Lebanon, whether in Syria, Jordan, Iraq, or elsewhere in the Middle East, the treatment that these Palestinians receive by their own brothers is absolutely horrific. I mean, they are barred visas from leaving the country. They are prevented from entering into the professions. Many of them are prevented from having a university education. And they are treated worse than third-class citizens. Surely this is the real apartheid that's taking place, the treatment of Palestinians in other Arab countries.
I agree 100% with you, but who talks about it? Apart from shows like this, where will you hear this in any radio or news or TV programme? You won't get it in the BBC, you won't get it in Sky News. And I was very lucky in the time when I was involved in politics that I went to a refugee camp. They don't look like refugee camps. I was at the Zavari camp for the Syrian civil war, and that was a tented village. These people are now living in what have become concrete refugee camps. And when the most worrying thing is that the descendants of the original refugees have become victims of the whole dispute, because I spoke to young people who said, in response to questions about how they feel about the right of return and issues like that, they expect to get back into what is now the state of Israel. It's moonshine. It's never going to happen. But the crisis that was created by the creation of UNWRA in 1949 has now come back to bite us in 2019 because there's no resolution in sight and they perpetuate the conflict.
Let's have a look at this excellent report produced by CBN, and in which Israeli experts have been examining the Palestinian school textbooks that is produced by UNWRA. Take a look at this shocking report.
This lady with a Palestinian scarf appears harmless, right?
But who is this? Dalal al-Mughrabi, who led a terrorist attack and murdered 38 people, including 13 children, on the coastal road of Israel in 1978.
Her picture appears in the 5th grade Arabic language textbook. It's part of a 4-page lesson that hails Mughrabi as a martyr who painted with her struggle a picture of challenge and heroism. The text in front of us provides a glance on the path of her struggle.
In these 4 pages, they're praising her and saying what a hero she was and how the younger generation needs to act exactly the same as she did.
Israeli Knesset member Sharon Haskell and David Badin of the Israel Resource News Agency spoke to journalists about reforms they believe need to happen.
Some of the major problems with UNWRA are perpetuating the conflict and perpetuating the hatred and the violence between Palestinians and Israelis.
CBN News asked UNWRA about the textbooks and education system. In a written statement, spokesman Christopher Gunnis told us, UNWRA teaches in accordance with UN values and principles. By convention, we teach the curriculum of host countries, i.e. the PA curriculum in the occupied territory. We review every book we use. We check for gender bias, age appropriateness, and political neutrality. On average, we have found less than 3% of the pages we have reviewed to be problematic. We have frameworks and procedures for supporting our teachers in dealing with these passages in the books. There are 515,000 Palestinian children in the UNWRA school system. Badin says if even 2% take up the terror challenge, that would create more than 10,000 terrorists. Badin sees other issues with UNWRA.
UNWRA is different from any other refugee organization because other refugee organizations help people get on with their lives. UNWRA, as a policy, teaches the concept of the right of return by force of arms.
That so-called right of return is also exaggerated by the very definition of Palestinian refugees.
UNWRA's got a completely different refugee definition than any other international organization. In UNWRA, a refugee status can be inherited, which means that they do not fulfill their basic agenda for what they were created for. It continues to build bigger and bigger refugee camps, give them permanent housing, give them permanent health care, give them a permanent education system. This is the role of a country, not a relief agency.
Haskell and Badin hope that President Trump's action to cut funding will force UNWRA to make changes. Julie Stahl, CBN News, Jerusalem.
As always, an excellent report there by CBN, our friends in the States. Michael, what is the position of the British government regarding UNWRA? And in light of these Palestinian textbooks and the glorification of terrorism and those who've committed acts of hideous terrorist attacks against Israel being glorified in these textbooks, surely this is another reason to say we should stop our funding of UNWRA.
Well, absolutely it is. The British government's position is hear no evil, see no evil. They have a memorandum of understanding with the Palestinian Authority signed by a DFID minister and a minister within the Palestinian Authority, which gives the rules. And the big rule is this. They agree to abide by the Quartet's principles of non-violence. That's me, very much paraphrasing it, but that's the underlying principle. And of course, they turn a blind eye to payments to people who have killed Israelis. They turn a blind eye to the payments that are made to shaheed, martyrs, people encouraged to give up their lives for the cause. They they ignore the incitement within the Palestinian Authority, Mahmoud Abbas, praising those people involved in those sorts of activities. They ignore the fact that in Palestinian schools, children are being taught to hate Jewish children. And as many great people before me have said, children aren't born to hate. They're taught to hate. And we see examples not only of the textbooks, but above blackboards in the classrooms, pictures of the suicide bombers and people who they consider to be martyrs for the cause. So the British government's reaction to that is The alternative is too difficult to deal with, so we'll ignore it. So whereas we will stop aid to Malawi, for example, when it's been proven that the Malawian government is behaving inappropriately. We stopped aid to Rwanda when it was suggested that Paul Kagame was funding M23 rebels in the Congo. But we'll turn a blind eye to payments to martyrs, payments to people who have murdered innocent Israelis. We'll turn a blind eye to incitement. And what they don't realise is that policy of appeasement, I have in my hand a piece of paper which is going to resolve all this, to put it that way, is that policy of appeasement makes the problems even deeper rooted and more difficult to deal with.
Michael, what's your response to the latest scandal that's hit the UN? According to my notes here, the management of the UN have been accused of serious abuses of power, including sexual misconduct, nepotism, and bullying. And this is an inquiry that's being produced by the UN's own ethics committee.
Yeah, none of it surprised me in any way, shape or form. One of the things that they do very well is deflection. When I was on the International Development Select Committee, we interviewed John Ging, who was in charge of the UNWRA element in Gaza. And John Ging, when we raised the issue about refugee numbers, he had this sort of like quizzical look in his face, as if to say, oh, that's not our problem. There's no connection between the work that they do and the problems on the ground. And so therefore, when you let an organisation run wild and do whatever it wants and to become the biggest, most expensive refugee organisation in the world, all sorts of things can happen. We know that their chief officer has been accused of hiring a woman who's alleged to be his mistress, and on a very high salary, and then he's flown her around the world with him in missions, all first class, of course, at the taxpayers' expense. And when I say the taxpayer, I mean the taxpayers of every nation that funds UNWRA, from Great Britain, well, up until recently the US, but Belgium, the Netherlands, and Spain, and so on and so forth. So therefore, none of it surprises me. I suspect that every single item is true. But you know something else? I think it only scraped the top of the barrel. I think the more they delve into what UNWRA is up to, they'll find out how deep that corruption is. And the worrying thing is that it's been kept going. 65% of the money they spend, that $1.6 billion a year that was referred to in a previous video, 65% of that goes in salaries. And they're trying to create a separate state and a civil society when they shouldn't be doing that. That shouldn't be part of their operations. Our civil society in the UK, as a developed and democratic nation, is looked after by a system of government, local, country, and then national, and soon to be non-EU, we hope. But the bottom line is this: in terms of the structures that have taken place to look after those Palestinian refugees, and again I put that in inverted commas, they are utterly corrupt to their core.
So let's have a look now at this excellent news report that shows the corruption that's hit the very top management of UNWRA.
In other news, it appears that United States President Donald Trump was onto something when he decided to defund the United Nations Relief and Works Agency, or UNWRA. As according to a leaked internal UN report, the agency is now being accused of mismanagement and abusing authority in the midst of a financial crisis. While UNWRA said that it is fully cooperating with the UN's investigation ever since this report found, quote, credible and corroborated instances of abuse of power stemming from the highest echelons of UNWRA's management, including from Commissioner General Pierre Cranbuel, who the report says promoted a woman with whom he had a romantic entanglement with. And then the two allegedly traveled the world together in business class, no less. But that said, for now, Cranbuel says that he would not hesitate to implement the findings from the investigation once it's completed. And that's good because the list of accusations are lengthy and damning. It mentions, for example, inappropriate sexual acts, nepotism, reprisals, discrimination, and other abuses of authority for personal gain and/or to suppress legitimate differences of opinion. Now, this report is not exactly new, however. It was initially sent to UN Security General Antonio Guterres in December, and the investigation has been ongoing ever since. Further, for now, 2 senior UNWRA officials have resigned in light of the report. But for years, the UN agency has battled accusations of corruption, as ostensibly, the organization is supposed to help millions of Palestinian refugees in Jordan, Lebanon, Syria, Gaza, and the West Bank. But accusations of collaborating with Hamas and helping with the indoctrination of Palestinian children to terror via their textbooks has left its critics livid. Further, United States Middle East peace envoy Jason Greenblatt said that he was extremely concerned about UNRWA allegations, and he accused the organization of peddling a broken and unsustainable model.
And that's what we're helping to fund, absolutely corrupt. Michael, we're down to the last 4 minutes of the programme, so I need to kind of wrap up quickly. But in light of the kind of Me Too movement and the fact that the UN Ethics Committee is looking into sexual misconduct at the very top management of UNRWA, how is this able to continue in light of these scandals? We've seen that the Dutch government, the Belgian government, also the Swiss government have decided to suspend financing of UNRWA while this investigation is going on. We've seen that earlier this year, in February, that the United States government pulled out 51 million euros. And now we see that the EU is stepping up its budget for UNRWA. When are the British and European taxpayers going to have a say and say, we don't want our money spent on this corrupt, useless UN agency?
Well, that's why we're going to start this campaign, hashtag 70 years of failure, because most people don't know anything about it. If you ask anybody in the street who or what is UNRWA, the answer will be, what are you talking about? They won't know. And therefore you have to raise public awareness. You have to raise that awareness among members of parliament so that they understand and can hold the government to account. And it's tragic that, of course, one part of me says that the British government should cease all funding immediately. But bear in mind, the implication of that will be is that the ordinary Palestinian people, children, mothers and fathers, who have become so dependent in this organisation, which is exactly what I would argue not UNRWA but the Palestinian leaders want, they have become so dependent in it that they would be left in utter penury if it didn't exist. You would have to create something else to fill the gaps that you would create. And that's why I disagree slightly with Donald Trump's position, because he stopped the funding to UNRWA without funding other organisations who could have given more direct aid to the children and so on and so forth. So in terms of the British government, it won't do anything for the reasons I've outlined earlier. So it's up to us as citizens to highlight these issues, to take the case to our politicians, to get the issue in the limelight, and then we take it from there.
And how can our viewers get involved in your latest campaign, Michael, and really let our political representatives know in Parliament about how our taxpayers' money is being wasted through the funding of UNRWA?
When we release the campaign, we'll be given details of how individuals can contact their members of parliament. Moreover, we are trying to expand the network not only to include the email system, but to include social media as well. And we will be highlighting each week in the lead up to that anniversary date all of the failures of UNRWA. And we hope we will educate not only a wider audience in terms of the general public, but crucially our members of parliament in order that they ask the tough questions of the government departments who are funding UNRWA as they currently do.
Michael, how can our viewers sign up, for those that haven't, because I know an awful lot of our viewers have signed up to IBA campaigns and alerts. How can they do so?
Well, as always, and if I'm looking directly into the camera, which one I'm on? This one here. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you for all your support so far. You can sign up to our campaigns by going to our website, which is www.israelbritain.org.uk, and just click on current campaign and you'll get all the details. And once again, thank you so much for your support.
Very, very good pledge there. And it's important, isn't it, that we actually hold our political representatives to account, particularly our ministers as well, because, you know, we don't want to be involved in something that is perpetuating the problem. It's not solving the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. It's creating worse conditions for the Palestinians themselves. They're in this perpetual cycle of where they are pawns in this bigger game between the Arab world and in Israel, and this is not in their best interests. So it's vital, isn't it, everyone gets involved. Anyway, we've come to the end of the programme. I just want to thank you so much for being my guest again on the Middle East Report, and well done for this campaign, which is really important.
Thank you, Simon.
And I just want to thank you for watching, today's programme. We discussed the corruption and also the fact that UNWRA, the United Nations Relief Works Agency, hasn't solved one single Palestinian refugee problem, and yet Israel has had to absorb over 700,000 Jewish refugees who've been living in the Arab lands for thousands of years, certainly since biblical times. And where's their justice? So I will leave you with this beautiful song produced by Ari Lesser in dedication to those forgotten Jewish refugees from Arab lands who were forced out of their homes with violence and were only able to carry a suitcase. So I want to thank you for watching today's Middle East Report.
Don't forget about the Jewish refugees forced to flee from their home countries. Tunisian, Yemenite, Lebanese, the Turkish, Moroccans, and Iraqis, Iranian, Jordanian, and Syrian, Egyptian, Libyan, Algerian. God only knows what would be their fate if it hadn't been for the Jewish state. 1947, the United Nations passed a resolution for the creation of both a Jewish and an Arab state by partitioning the British Mandate. But the Arab world rejected the plan, couldn't stand the thought of a Jewish land, and the armies of 5 Arab nations attacked was an act of war, so the Jews fought back. Thousands on both sides wound up dead in the violence. Many Palestinians fled, and the families of these who ran away are the refugees you hear about today. But there's another story that must be told, not as well known, but it's just as old, about the Jewish refugees forced to flee from almost every Arab country. Don't forget about the Jewish refugees forced to flee from their home countries. Tunisian, Yemenite, Lebanese, the Turkish, Moroccans, and Iraqis, Iranian, Jordanian, and Syrian, Egyptian, Libyan, Algerian. God only knows what would be their fate if it hadn't been for the Jewish state. You see, 1 million Jews lived in relative peace, scattered all over the Middle East. But after the 1948 war, we just weren't welcome there anymore. Arabs forced us to flee in fear from homes we'd known for 1,000 years. Faced with pogroms and bomb attacks, most left with just the shirts on their backs. They froze our Jewish bank accounts and stole our land in large amounts. Today, if you try to add up the cost, there's over $6 billion lost. With no other options, most came straight to the newly founded Jewish state. And until this day, most Israelis are descendants of these Jewish refugees. So don't forget about the Jewish refugees forced to flee from their home countries. Tunisian, Yemenite, Lebanese, the Turkish, Moroccans, and Iraqis, Iranian, Jordanian, and Syrian, Egyptian, Libyan, Algerian. God only knows what would be their fate if it hadn't been for the Jewish state. I understand why some Palestinians yearn to be granted the right of return to the place where their ancestors lived before the events of the 1948 war. Yet I just can't help but contemplate what would happen if Israel opened its gates when the Arab nations all heard the news. Do you think that they would do the same for the Jews? Would they give citizenship to the families of the 850,000 refugees and return all of their stolen properties back to the Jews from whom they were seized? Would they issue apologies for the bombs, anti-Jewish riots, and pogroms which forced nearly 1 million Jews to run for their lives with nothing to lose? Don't forget about the Jewish refugees forced to flee from their home countries. Tunisian, Yemenite, Lebanese, the Turkish, Moroccans, and Iraqis, Iranian, Jordanian, and Syrian, Egyptian, Libyan, Algerian. God only knows what would be their fate if it hadn't been for the Jewish state.